In 1887, 150 men were buried alive. Their deaths paid for the construction of one of the most beautiful castles in the world. The reason? The owner decided to save money on ventilation. His mines ran on children, boys of 8, 10, 12 years old. Their lives were expendable material. When the workers demanded a pay raise, he used a Gatling gun against them, not against an enemy, against his own. And with that money, he built this. Today, we call it a national treasure of Canada and take pictures of it in awe. And here is the question you must answer. How does a palace built on blood turn into a tourist postcard? We will show you this process, step by step, and we will tell you why the most hated man of his era went to all this trouble for the one single thing he could never buy. This is Craigdarroch, a dream embodied in stone. It towers over the city of Victoria like a promise from another, more elegant age. Its sandstone towers catch the golden light of sunset. Its stained glass windows tell stories from Shakespeare, refracting the light into hundreds of ruby and sapphire shards. Every day, hundreds of people come here. They look up in reverence. They photograph its grandeur, touch the cool stone, and whisper about beauty, about heritage, about a fairy tale frozen in time. But this stone remembers. This beauty has a price, hard cut. The music stops. Before us are not sun-drenched lawns, but the eternal darkness of a mine entrance, a black and white world of soot and despair. Look closely at these faces. These are not the faces of men. These are the faces of children. 8 years old, 10, 12. Boys with the eyes of old men, their lungs already filled with coal dust. Hands that should have been holding toys held pickaxes. This is the empire of Robert Dunsmuir, the source of the wealth that would erect that castle on the hill. Archival footage. Panic and smoke. Rescuers carry out bodies. The year is 1887. A methane explosion in the Nanaimo No. 1 mine. 150 men buried alive. 150 families destroyed in an instant because ventilation was too expensive. Because safety was a line item that the owner crossed out. Let's return to the castle, to its perfect proportions and flawless masonry. The wealth that paid for this tower was extracted from that very mine. The fortune that allowed this oak to be brought from Chicago and this mahogany from Spain was built on child labor and broken lives. Every intricate pattern on the fireplace tiles is the shadow of a miner who never came home. This is not just a house. It is a monument. A monument to an era when a human life had a clear price, and that price was frighteningly low. In a newspaper cartoon of the time, he was depicted as a king. But he isn't sitting on a throne of gold. He is seated on a mountain of human skulls, and his crown is cast from the frozen tears of widows and orphans. His name was Robert Dunsmuir, the richest, the most powerful, and perhaps the most despised man of his time. And here, the main, uncomfortable question of our story is born. How could the most ruthless monster of his era create something that we proudly call a national treasure today? At what point does a palace built on blood become just a beautiful building? And can we, while admiring the creation, forget the price paid for it by those whose names history has not preserved? History loves the myth of the self-made man, of poor immigrants who step off the ship with empty pockets but hearts full of hope, and build a new life by the sheer force of their will. The story of Robert Dunsmuir begins just like that, but some success stories are written not in ink, but in blood. 1851. Dunsmuir, a Scottish miner who fled poverty, is hired by the Hudson's Bay Company. His salary is $25 a week. He is illiterate, abrasive, and obsessed with one idea, one smell, one color, the black sheen of coal. While other workers rest, he wanders the forests of Vancouver Island. He isn't looking for beauty. He's looking for cracks in the earth, signs of what lies hidden beneath his feet. It wasn't luck. It was calculation. When he finally finds it, the richest coal seam, which would be named Wellington, he does so on his own time. A legal loophole that allowed him to declare, "This is mine." But a mine needs money. Dunsmuir finds it. Lieutenant Diggle and Horace Lascelles, two gentlemen with capital, believed in his animal instinct. They invested $8,000. Dunsmuir invested something more valuable, a complete lack of conscience. As soon as the mine began to yield enormous profits, he methodically, coldly, and legally squeezed them out of the business. They were left with a small settlement. He was left with an empire. This was his first lesson in power. Never share. Now he needed fuel for his wealth machine, and he found the cheapest kind. Dunsmuir's mines ran on a special raw material, on childhood. Boys who were 8, 10, 12 years old descended into the darkness for 10, 12 hours a day. Their small bodies were perfect for working in the narrow tunnels. Their lives, expendable material. And when the adult workers dared to demand more, Dunsmuir used a tactic that would become his signature. He brought in ships of Chinese workers. He paid them $1 a day, half of what a white miner earned. He didn't just hire strikebreakers. He imported racial hatred as a business tool. He pitted desperate people against each other, knowing that as long as they hated their neighbor, they could not unite against the real enemy, against him. The climax came in 1877. A strike. The Wellington miners demanded a pay raise. Dunsmuir's response was swift and merciless. First, he evicted their families from the company-owned houses. Women and children were thrown onto the street. And then he turned to the government. 150 soldiers of the Canadian militia entered the mining town, and with them, a Gatling gun, a rapid-fire machine gun, not for a war with an enemy, for a war with his own workers. The strike was crushed. The lesson was learned. But even that wasn't enough. Dunsmuir's final, greatest move was made not in the mine, but in the halls of power. A contract to build a railway. In exchange for 77 miles of track, he and his partners received $750,000 in cash and land, 2 million acres, almost 25% of all of Vancouver Island, with all its forests and, more importantly, all its mineral rights. He wasn't just building a railway, he was buying himself a kingdom. The wealth was created, absolute, obscene, built on bones and despair. The price was horrifying, but now he faced a new problem. He had become the richest man in British Columbia, but money couldn't buy him the one thing he desired most: respect. And so, he decided to build it, out of stone and granite. Robert Dunsmuir was a king. He had mines, railways, ships, and a fortune capable of buying a small country. But in the refined drawing rooms of Victoria, this outpost of the British Empire on the edge of the world, he was a nobody. To the old money aristocrats, whose wealth was measured in generations, not in tons of coal, he was just an upstart, an uncouth Scotsman whose millions smelled of sweat and coal dust. Their weapons were barely perceptible smirks, quiet whispers behind fans, a polite contempt honed to perfection. He could crush a union. He could bankrupt a competitor, but he could not force them to respect him. And so he decided to give his answer, an answer that could not be ignored, an answer made of stone and granite. He didn't buy a house on the same street as them. He chose the highest hill in the city, a place from which he could look down on them, in the most literal sense of the word. Every morning, as they opened the curtains in their cozy Victorian mansions, they would have to see it. His creation, his power, towering over their world. And he didn't build just another elegant mansion. That would have meant playing by their rules. Instead, he turned to the memory of his homeland, to the most brutal and impregnable style imaginable. Scottish baronial. This is not architecture. It is a declaration. Thick, rough sandstone walls, towers that look like clenched fists, arrow-slit windows. This is not a house that invites guests. It is a fortress ready for a siege. Every line of this building, every stone, shouted to the entire city, "You can hate me, you can despise me, but you cannot pretend that I do not exist." It was a weapon in a class war. But behind this wall of granite and pride, another story was hidden, one that Dunsmuir never told his enemies. A vow made many years ago to his wife, Joan, when they lived in a miserable shack and their only wealth was hope. He swore to her that one day he would build a castle worthy of a queen. And now he was fulfilling his promise. The castle was his trophy, which he presented to her, proof that he had conquered this new, hostile world. Thus, Craigdarroch was born from two of Robert Dunsmuir's great passions, from his fierce pride and his deep, albeit peculiar love. It was conceived not just as a home, but as an eternal monument, the cradle of a dynasty that would rule this land for centuries, until the coal dust on his money finally turned into the noble patina of time. He had found a way to make the elite look up to him. The plan was flawless, but he did not yet know that his greatest enemy was not human envy, but nature itself. And to erect his monument, he would have to go to war with the entire planet. Stone knows no morality. Mountains do not judge men. To nature, the will of man is but a temporary inconvenience. Before Robert Dunsmuir could challenge the aristocrats of Victoria, he had to declare war on geography itself. And his first battle was with the land on which he stood, the foundation, the basis of everything. For his fortress, Dunsmuir chose granite, a symbol of eternity and unyielding might. 2,500 tons of gray, defiant stone. Today, we only see the tops of these blocks, peeking out from the ground. But back then, it was a mountain that had to be split, lifted, and dragged to the top of the hill. Picture the scene. Hundreds of workers, their muscles filled with sweat and fury. Dozens of horses, their flanks heaving with the strain. The creak of wooden rollers, the groan of ropes stretched to their limit, the clang of iron against stone. This wasn't construction. This was a primal battle of man against rock. Every inch that another boulder was moved was a victory, torn from gravity, from inertia, from the very essence of the universe. The rock yielded slowly, reluctantly, but it yielded. Because behind the workers stood an invisible but omnipotent force, Dunsmuir's capital, which could hire another 100 hands, buy another dozen horses, break another 1,000 levers. The foundation was laid. Now the fortress needed skin. And here, the second phase of the war began, a war against distance. Dunsmuir didn't want to build his castle from what was at hand. That would be too simple, too provincial. His castle had to be the embodiment of his global power. It was a titan, assembled from pieces from all over the world. Ships went out to sea. Sandstone for the walls, warm, reddish, like a desert at sunset, was brought from Arizona. It was loaded onto barges, floated down rivers, and reloaded onto sea vessels that rounded half the continent. White oak for the grand staircase and panels, strong and noble, was delivered by rail from Chicago, from the very heart of America, and for the dining hall, the place where he would receive his vanquished enemies, he demanded the very best. And so the ships sailed again, this time across the Atlantic, to bring the rarest mahogany from Spain. This was not construction. This was a military operation, a logistical nightmare that became a demonstration of power. Every creak of a ship's rigging, every whistle of a steam engine hauling cargo for the castle, was paid for with coal from his mines. He was literally turning the black filth from under the ground into a global supply network that converged at a single point, on this hill. He conquered nature and compressed space, proving that for his money, no borders existed. He had conquered stone and ocean. But now he had to contend with something far more fragile and unpredictable: human nature. With those who were meant to assemble this titan, a strange, almost impossible world reigned on the construction site of Craigdarroch. It was an island of prosperity in the middle of an ocean of hatred that the working class felt for Dunsmuir. Here, on the hill, he paid. He paid generously. The stonemasons, carpenters, woodcarvers, these were not the exhausted miners. This was the elite, the finest craftsmen of their time, gathered from across the continent. Their hands, accustomed to the most delicate work, received a wage a miner below could only dream of. Dunsmuir knew. To build a monument to eternity, you couldn't skimp on skill. But a shadow constantly hung over this island of well-being, the shadow of the master himself. Robert Dunsmuir was not a man who wrote a check and walked away. He was everywhere. His stern, stocky figure in a simple frock coat could appear at any moment. He didn't trust the architects. He didn't trust the foremen. He trusted only his own eyes and the instinct honed by years of fighting for every cent. We see him in the construction office. Evening. The light of a kerosene lamp snatches his face from the gloom, wrinkled, stubborn, with eyes that see everything. A cost estimate lies before him, long columns of numbers, neatly written by a clerk's hand. Dunsmuir, almost illiterate, doesn't read the words. He reads the numbers. He sees in them not just expenses. He sees potential weakness, an attempt to cheat him. His finger, thick and calloused, slides slowly across the paper. It stops. Extra nails. Lime is too expensive. 2 hours of overtime for a mason. Why? He picks up a pencil and with a sharp, angry motion, crosses out the line. Again and again. Each stroke saves a few dollars. For a man whose fortune is estimated at $15 million, this is dust. But for him, it was a principle. It was the same battle he had fought his entire life. A battle against a world that, he was certain, was always trying to take something from him. This was his essence, his paradox. He was a creator and a miser at the same time. He was erecting a palace worthy of a European monarch, but he haggled over every box of nails. He hired genius carvers, but he recounted their work hours with the tenacity of a shopkeeper. He was building a dream, but he did it with the cold, ruthless accounting of a prison warden. The workers on the site felt it. They got their money, but they knew they were being watched, that their every move was being judged not by the standard of art, but by the standard of efficiency. The master paid for their hands, but he was profoundly indifferent to what was in their souls. To him, they were just another resource, more expensive than coal, but just as replaceable. He built his fortress, but he failed to consider that the main threat would come not from the outside, but from within. Not from those who worked for him for money, but from those who were supposed to share in his triumph. 1888. The castle is growing. The stone skeleton has already taken on flesh. The towers reach for the sky, and with each day, the building looks more like the brutal, domineering image that existed in Dunsmuir's imagination. It seems nothing can stop this process. The will of one man, backed by limitless capital, can move mountains and stitch continents together. But there is a force that cannot be bought, intimidated, or bypassed: death. And it doesn't strike Dunsmuir himself. It strikes at the very heart of the project, at its brain. Warren Williams, the chief architect from Portland, the man who had translated Dunsmuir's fury and ambition into the language of blueprints and calculations, suddenly dies. Right in the middle of the work, chaos descends on the construction site. Williams wasn't just a designer. He was the conductor of this complex orchestra of stone, wood, and human labor. All the threads converged in his hands. Only he fully understood what every curve of the staircase should look like, where every beam should be placed, how the complex heating and gas lighting system was to be woven into the castle's medieval shell. And now, he was gone. The project hangs over an abyss. The blueprints exist, but they are mute. They cannot answer the thousands of daily questions that arise on site. The workers stop. The foremen throw up their hands. The momentum that seemed unstoppable grinds to a halt. Management of the project passes to Williams's assistant, Arthur Smith. Young, inexperienced, he suddenly finds himself at the helm of a giant ship caught in a storm. He conscientiously tries to follow his teacher's plans, but he is no Williams. His actions lack that confidence, that brilliant intuition. Mistakes, delays, and arguments begin to plague the site. Chaos and uncertainty become the new foreman. For Robert Dunsmuir, this is not just a production problem. It is a personal challenge, an insult. Fate itself seemed to be mocking him, taking away the chief executor of his will. At that moment, the castle ceased to be just a building. It became a battlefield. A battle between the will of one aging tycoon and the impersonal chaos of the universe. Could he, a man who had spent his life breaking both people and nature to his will, see it through to the end? Could his obsession replace the genius of the dead architect? He doubles his control. He spends his days and nights on the construction site, trying to force the stone to obey through his animal instinct, his unbending will. He yells at the workers. He argues with the foreman. He makes Smith redo the drawings again and again. He is not building. He is at war with the ghost of failure, with the shadow of death that has already touched his grand design. He does not yet know that this shadow has not only come for his architect, it has come for him too. While a battle with chaos and death raged outside, a completely different world was being born inside the stone fortress. A world of absolute, defiant, almost obscene luxury. If the castle's walls were a statement of power, its interior was a hymn to wealth. This wasn't just decorating a home. This was a competition with the kings and emperors of the old world, whom Dunsmuir, the illiterate Scottish coal miner, was challenging. The focus shifts to the details, to the slow, meditative labor of the craftsman. We see the hands of a woodcarver, not the rough hands of a stonemason, but the fingers of a surgeon dancing with a chisel. From beneath his tool, out of a formless piece of Spanish mahogany, a griffin is born, a dragon spreads its wings, a heraldic lily blooms. 1,888 feet of the rarest wood are transformed into panels for the dining hall. Every curl, every line was paid for with tons of coal burned in the furnaces of San Francisco. And then, light. Not just light, but light that passed through art. 32 unique stained glass windows, commissioned from the finest craftsmen in America. Dunsmuir, a man who could barely read his own name, demanded that the windows of his house tell stories. Stories from Shakespeare. King Lear going mad in the storm. Romeo and Juliet on the balcony. This was not just a tribute to culture. It was an attempt to buy it, to appropriate it. If he could not read these great tragedies, he could encase them in a lead frame and make them shine for him. Every day, the sun passing through these windows was meant to remind him and his guests that he was the owner not only of coal and iron, but of high culture as well. Underfoot, another demonstration of power. The floors. Not just planks, but a most intricate mosaic of 5 of the rarest types of wood. White oak, brought from Chicago. Dark, almost black mahogany. Golden maple, cherry with its deep ruby hue, and noble walnut. They were woven into patterns, creating a work of art underfoot, meant to be walked upon. It was a map of his empire, assembled from conquered forests. Every element of the interior was a trophy. 17 fireplaces, and no two alike. Marble from Italy, tiles from England, cast iron grates made to special order. All of this did not just create coziness. It screamed of wealth, of a power that could reach any corner of the world, take the very best from it, and bring it here, to this hill on the edge of civilization. The castle was filling with luxury, like a dragon's hoard. But in this hymn to wealth, unsettling notes were already sounding. He was creating a perfect world within the walls, not noticing that hatred was accumulating outside them. He polished the wood and installed the stained glass, not understanding that he was building not a home, but a mausoleum. A mausoleum for a dream that would die with him. Externally, Craigdarroch was an anachronism, a fortress from the Dark Ages transported to the 19th century. It quoted the past, spoke the language of barons and knights. But this was only a shell. Behind the thick sandstone walls lay not just a tribute to the past, but a machine of the future. Robert Dunsmuir was not building a medieval ruin. He was building the most modern house of his time. This chapter is a journey inside the walls, into the circulatory and nervous system of the building. We see not woodcarvers, but plumbers and engineers, men in work overalls, laying kilometers of pipes, the arteries and veins of this stone giant. Here they are, installing the central heating system, a complex network of cast iron radiators connected to a gigantic boiler in the basement. In a world where most people still warmed themselves by fireplaces, battling drafts, Dunsmuir's castle was to breathe with a steady, constant warmth. This was not just a convenience. It was a symbol of industrial power. The heat, born from burning his own coal, would now flow through the veins of his house like blood, proving that his power was based not on ancient titles, but on control over energy. And here, the installation of gas pipes. In each of the 39 rooms, there was to be light, not the flickering light of candles, but the bright, hissing flame of gas jets. The castle was to shine on the hill like a beacon, visible for many miles, a beacon that showed the entire city. Here lives a man who has tamed not only the earth, but fire itself. But the most amazing marvel of technology was hidden within the walls. It was an early analog of the telephone, speaking tubes, a network of thin copper tubes connecting the rooms. The lady of the house could approach a small mouthpiece in the wall, press a button, and a whistle would sound in the servants' quarters. A maid would approach her end of the tube and hear an order given from the other side of the enormous house. This was the nervous system of the building, a system of instant control. Dunsmuir, a man who managed thousands of workers from a distance, wanted to have the same absolute power inside his home. Every corner of the castle had to be connected, subordinate to a single center of will. 4 bathrooms, an unheard-of luxury in an era when bathing was a weekly ritual. Hot and cold water flowing from taps. All of this transformed the castle into an autonomous, self-sufficient organism. A machine for living, as the architects of the next century would call it. Dunsmuir intuitively understood. True power in the industrial age was not swords and coats of arms, but technology. Control over heat, light, and communication. His castle was a hybrid, a medieval knight in armor, within which beat a steam heart and through whose nerves flowed an electric current. He was building a monument to his time, a time when the raw power of coal gave birth to marvels of engineering. He was creating a perfect, controlled environment. But he forgot that the most destructive forces, hatred, envy, and betrayal, do not submit to technology, and they were already gathering at his gates. While on the hill, in a world of perfect luxury and cutting-edge technology, craftsmen were installing the last stained glass window down below, in the valley, in a world of coal dust and cheap whiskey. Hatred was simmering. For the residents of the mining towns of Wellington and Nanaimo, the castle was not a marvel of architecture. It was a reproach, an insult, carved in stone. Every day, they raised their heads and saw it grow, saw its towers scratch the sky, and they knew what paid for every stone. It was paid for with their health, their poverty, the lives of their comrades who died in the darkness underground. This was not Craigie Dawn. This was the palace on blood. The newspapers of the time, especially those that supported the labor movement, did not mince words. Their pages were full of venom and sarcasm. Journalists gave him a new name that caught on with the people. They didn't call him Robert Dunsmuir. They called him Robber Dunsmuir, the robber baron. Caricatures depicted him as a vampire, sucking the blood from the workers, a demon building himself an altar of human bones. This hatred was not abstract. It was becoming more and more personal and dangerous. Rumors began to creep through the mining settlements. A dark, sinister whisper. There was talk of revenge, of anarchists, of secret societies that swore Dunsmuir would never enter his castle alive. There was talk of dynamite, which was so easy to steal from the mine, of an assassination attempt being plotted in the darkness. There is no documentary evidence of this. History has not preserved the names or specific plans of the conspirators. But there's no smoke without fire. Dunsmuir himself took these rumors very seriously. He, a man who had spent his life breaking others, understood perfectly well what people driven to desperation were capable of. The construction site, this island of prosperity, was gradually becoming a fortress in 2 senses. Now it was guarded not only from thieves, but from avengers. Security around the site was tightened. At night, men with rifles stood guard. Every new worker was vetted. Dunsmuir was building his castle while simultaneously under siege. The irony was cruel. He erected a fortress to protect himself from the contempt of the aristocrats, only to be forced to defend it from the fury of those by whose labor he overcame that contempt. The castle, conceived as a symbol of his absolute power over the world, became a symbol of his absolute alienation from it. He stood on his hill, surrounded by walls of stone and a wall of hatred. He was a king in his castle, but outside its walls, he was a tyrant with a death sentence passed upon him. He could hire guards, he could build the thickest walls, but he could not stop time, and he could not defeat the enemy that had already taken up residence in his own body. Time was the one resource Robert Dunsmuir couldn't buy, the one enemy he could not crush. He was over 60 For a man of his generation, born in poverty and having spent his youth underground, this was a profoundly old age. And his body, this worn-out machine he had driven without pity his entire life, began to fail. Dunsmuir's health was deteriorating rapidly. The illness, which doctors spoke of only in hushed, cautious whispers, was gnawing at him from within. But the weaker his body became, the more fiercely his will burned. Now, the construction of the castle was no longer just a project. It had become a race against death. We see him in his final months, which he still spent on the construction site. He is no longer that strong, imperious master. He has aged, grown gaunt. His gait has become heavy, but his gaze, the gaze of a predator unwilling to surrender, remains the same. He knows he has almost no time left, and this knowledge makes him twice the tyrant. He rushes the workers. He shouts at the foreman. He cares nothing for fatigue, for mistakes, for common sense. The castle must be finished. Now. Immediately. Every day of delay is a day stolen from his triumph. He cannot afford this theft. The camera focuses on his face as he stands on an unfinished terrace, looking at the rising walls. In his eyes is a mixture of pride and a desperate animal anguish. He doesn't just see stone and wood. He sees his eternity, his one chance at immortality. He has poured into these walls his entire life, all his fury, all his loneliness, and now he desperately clung to the chance to see his victory. The workers whisper behind his back. They see him struggling up the scaffolding, leaning on a cane, gasping for breath, yet still giving orders. They don't just see a demanding master. They see a man fighting his last, most important battle. Dunsmuir put everything into this castle, but he failed to account for one simple, brutal rule. A house is built for living, and he was building his while already standing on the threshold of death. He was trying to erect a monument to his dynasty, but in reality, he was building himself the world's most expensive sarcophagus, and he was desperately rushing to lie down in it. 1890. The last worker gathers his tools. The last brushstroke of paint dries on the wall. The last shard of glass is swept from the perfectly polished parquet floor. Silence. After 3 years of rumbling, shouting, and the clang of metal, a booming, solemn silence descends upon the hill. Craigdarroch is ready. It is perfect. It is exactly as its master envisioned. Brutal on the outside, exquisite on the inside. It towers over the city like an undeniable fact, like the material embodiment of victory. Every tower, every stained glass window, every inch of carved wood, everything is in its place. The dream has taken form. The triumph is complete, but the flawless windows reflect only the empty sky. The floors, polished to a mirror shine, reflect only the shadows of clouds. In the vast halls, the echo of silence reverberates. The castle fortress, the castle weapon, the castle promise stands finished, perfect, and utterly uninhabited. Its master does not see it. Robert Dunsmuir, the man whose will moved mountains and joined oceans, had lost his final race. He died in April of 1889, 18 months before his dream was finally realized. He never saw the finished interiors. He never walked up the grand staircase. He never sat by the fireplace in his study to look down upon the city he had conquered. It was the greatest and most brutal irony of his life. He had defeated all his enemies, competitors, unions, aristocrats, geography itself. But he lost to time. He built the stage for his triumph, but died in the wings, never taking his bow. His entire life had been dedicated to one goal, to prove his worth to the world. And now, the proof was ready. The monument to his will stood, gleaming in the sunlight. But the man for whom it was all built lay in his grave. He created the perfect vessel for his dynasty, but that vessel was empty. The castle awaited its king, but the king was dead. And in the power vacuum he left behind, a bomb he himself had planted years ago was about to explode. A bomb that would destroy his dynasty faster than the workers had managed to build its cradle. Robert Dunsmuir's death did not bring peace. On the contrary, it was the signal for the start of a new, even more brutal war. A war waged not in the mines or on the stock exchanges, but in courtrooms and on the pages of newspapers. A war within his own family. The battlefield was the last document he ever signed, his will. On the day the notary unsealed the envelope, a tense silence hung in the room. Dunsmuir's sons, James and Alexander, waited. They had worked for their father their entire lives. They had swallowed coal dust, managed mines, conducted negotiations. They were the heirs, the princes of the coal empire. They were waiting to receive their kingdom. And then came the words that were a stunning slap in the face, a bomb that exploded in the very heart of the family. Everything, absolutely everything. The fortune of $15 million, the coal mines, the railway, the ships, and of course, Craigdarroch Castle, the still unfinished symbol of their future power. All of it went not to them, but to their mother, Joan Dunsmuir. The sons were not just disinherited, they were humiliated, erased from the history they had helped to write. In their father's eyes, they were nothing. The rage that had been building for years under the thumb of the despotic patriarch erupted immediately. Without waiting for the ink to dry on the death certificate, James and Alexander filed a lawsuit against their own mother. This wasn't just a lawsuit. It was the biggest scandal in Canadian history. The entire country held its breath, watching as one of the nation's wealthiest families publicly devoured itself. The accusations were monstrous. The sons claimed that their father, on his deathbed, was not of sound mind, that their mother, Joan, had taken advantage of his weakness. They didn't say it outright, but they hinted at something dark, almost medieval. They accused her of undue influence, of manipulation, almost of witchcraft. Newspaper cartoons appeared depicting Joan as a witch, whispering words to her dying husband that would strip his sons of their birthright. The family that was meant to be a dynasty had turned into a nest of vipers. The castle, which was supposed to be their ancestral fortress, became the grand prize in this ugly battle. It was still under construction, its walls still smelling of fresh mortar, yet a war was already being fought for it. A war not for life, but to the death. Robert Dunsmuir had spent his life building an empire based on control and power. But his final act of power, his will, did not strengthen it, but destroyed it. He thought he was having the final word, but in reality, he was lighting the fuse that would blow his legacy apart from the inside. The castle was almost ready, but now it was completely unclear who would become its master and whether it would turn from a dream palace into a monument to family hatred. The judge's gavel fell, or so it seemed. Joan Dunsmuir, the widow, the woman accused of witchcraft by her own sons, walked out of the courtroom victorious. The empire and the castle were hers. She moved into Craigdarroch, not as if into a dream home, but into a conquered citadel. With her were her unmarried daughters. The family was fractured, but the fortress had been taken. And so the performance began. The castle, built as a challenge to the aristocracy, now had to seduce it. Its doors were thrown open. The high society of Victoria flocked there, politicians, wealthy heirs, British officers. The fourth-floor ballroom, designed with a spring-loaded floating floor, came alive with the click of heels and the rustle of silk dresses. Music flowed like a river, champagne like a waterfall. Joan Dunsmuir, the lady of the castle, tried to buy what her husband had never been able to conquer: acceptance. Every glass raised in that hall, every compliment paid to her daughters, was a small victory in her long war. But when the last carriage departed and the servants extinguished the gaslights, the castle died. Grandeur turned into an oppressive emptiness. 39 rooms, 17 fireplaces, kilometers of corridors. All of it was silent. The high ceilings, adorned with plasterwork paid for with the lives of miners, now listened not to laughter, but to silence. The castle that was meant to be the cradle of a dynasty had in fact become a luxurious, lonely prison, a gilded cage. At the center of this cage was the figure of her daughter, Laura, a talented pianist whose fingers could make the grand piano sing. But her music was not a joy, it was a duty. At every reception, her domineering mother forced her to play for the guests, turning her gift into just another piece of interior decor, like a Persian rug or a Chinese vase. She was a captive bird whose song was meant to entertain her jailers. Legend says that her spirit never left that cage, that at night, when not a single lamp is lit in the empty ballroom, the sound of a piano drifts from the darkness, a sad, ghostly melody. It is Laura, forever locked in the castle, playing for guests who are long gone. Joan Dunsmuir ruled her little kingdom for 18 years. She hosted balls, married off her daughters, and maintained the facade of indestructible power. She believed she had won. She sat on the throne her husband had built. But she failed to consider one thing. The throne stood on a foundation of coal, and the coal empire was a living, hungry beast that demanded an iron hand. She had won the battle for the castle's walls. But could a Victorian-era woman control the beast her husband had left behind? 1908, death comes to Craigdarroch once again. This time, it takes the mistress of the house. Joan Dunsmuir, the matriarch who won the war for the inheritance, passes away, leaving behind an empire without an emperor. And in that same moment, the illusion of an eternal dynasty, for which so much sweat and blood was spilled, begins to crumble to dust. Her daughters, raised in a gilded cage, were princesses, not queens. They knew how to play music, speak French, and receive guests. But they had no idea how to manage coal mines, how to fight trade unions, or how to play the stock market. The beast they inherited was more than they could handle, and the upkeep of the castle, this stone leviathan, devoured money with monstrous speed. A humiliating, unthinkable decision has to be made. A decision that will finally erase the Dunsmuir name from the map of great dynasties. The year is 1909, the great auction. The doors of Craigdarroch are open to all, but these are not guests invited to a ball. They are appraisers, merchants, and mere gawkers who have come to watch a giant fall. Everything that Robert Dunsmuir had so furiously collected from around the world now goes under the hammer. Carved panels of Spanish mahogany, for which he haggled to the last cent. Stained glass windows with scenes from Shakespeare, his purchased culture. The grand piano on which the unfortunate Laura played. Silver, porcelain, carpets, everything. The soul of the castle is sold off, piece by piece, to the indifferent rap of the auctioneer's gavel. But the pinnacle of the fall, the most humiliating act of this drama, is yet to come. The estate, 28 acres of the finest land in Victoria, surrounding the castle. It isn't sold, it's raffled off in a lottery. A ticket costs $1. Every clerk, every dock worker, every one of Dunsmuir's former miners can now buy a chance to own a piece of land they once feared to even set foot on. The dream of an ancestral home, to be passed down from generation to generation, is sold off piecemeal for the price of a mug of beer. And finally, the castle itself. The fortress that cost $500,000, a fortune. It is sold to the developer who organized the lottery, sold for a paltry $38,000, the price of a good townhouse. Only 18 years. Only 18 years have passed since Joan Dunsmuir first crossed its threshold. In less than 2 decades, the dream of an eternal dynasty had turned to dust. The empire crumbled, the treasures were sold off. The castle, deprived of its soul and purpose, stood on its hill like an empty shell, washed up on the shore of history. It seemed this was the end, a final and inglorious defeat. Robert Dunsmuir had lost, his legacy was destroyed, but he was mistaken. His true legacy was not in family or in money, it was in the stone, and the stone had its own, entirely different destiny. The castle was supposed to die. After its soul was sold off at auction, it should have slowly crumbled, turning into a Gothic ruin, a sad monument to collapsed ambitions. But the stone remembers, and this stone had its own will to live, independent of its creator's will. Its long, strange journey through the 20th century began. Each new incarnation was a humiliation for the original design. During the First World War, the castle built for balls was converted into a military hospital. In its luxurious halls, where waltzes were meant to be heard, there was now the smell of antiseptics and the groans of wounded soldiers. The gilded cage became a sanctuary for broken bodies. Then, in 1921, it became Victoria College. The hallways, designed for silent servants, were filled with the noise and laughter of hundreds of students. The study where Dunsmuir planned to run his empire became a lecture hall where democracy and human rights were taught. The most prosaic and final humiliation awaited it after the war. It became the office of the school board. The tyrant's palace turned into a kingdom of bureaucracy. In the grand dining room stood filing cabinets, and the parquet floor, made of 5 types of wood, became scuffed by office chairs. By the 1960s, it was a shadow of its former self. Forgotten, dilapidated, needed by no one. They wanted to tear it down to build a parking lot in its place. Robert Dunsmuir's dream of eternity was to end under the wheels of automobiles. And this is where the greatest paradox occurs. Salvation came not from millionaires or aristocrats. It came from below, from ordinary citizens, teachers, historians, the common people of Victoria, who in 1959 created the Castle Society for its preservation. The very common people Dunsmuir so despised united to save his creation. The building, constructed as the ultimate symbol of elite private power, survived only by becoming public property. Today, tourists from all over the world pay to walk through its halls. They listen to the story of the ruthless coal baron, his feud with his sons, the ghost of the unhappy pianist. The castle has outlived its creator. It has outlived his family, his empire, and his infamy. The bloody history of its origin has turned into a legend, a commodity, a piece of cultural heritage. It stands on its hill, not as a monument to Robert Dunsmuir. It stands as a monument over his grave, a silent witness to the fact that the most titanic ambitions of one man eventually become just a page in the collective history written by all. And the main question it asks us today is simple and eternal. At what point does a crime, frozen in stone, become merely beauty? And can we, while admiring the legacy, ever forget its price? And so, history comes full circle. The fortress, born from one man's pride to wall himself off from the world, outlived its creator and his dynasty to become the property of that very world. The stone, mixed with blood and despair, over time turned into a legacy, and the tragedy into a legend told to tourists. But does time erase the price? And can we, looking at the perfection of the creation, afford ourselves the luxury of forgetting by whom and how it was paid for? This dialogue has no end, and your opinion is its most important part. Share your thoughts in the comments, because it is for stories like these that our channel exists. Your support, in the form of a like and a subscription, will allow us to continue telling them.